Joining me now is the best-selling author of groundbreaking works, including The Strange Death of Europe and The Madness of Crowds. And he's also the associate editor of The Spectator, Douglas Murray. Douglas, let's start with Joe Biden, who had another fall today. The 80-year-old had a heavy fall at a graduation ceremony for the US Air Force Academy in Colorado. And his problems don't end with his obvious cognitive and physical decline. You've written in the UK Telegraph about Joe Biden's Democrats being talentless, extreme, and about to face a reckoning. Tell me about this.
Well, that's right, Rita. You and I have discussed before the very odd gerontocracy that exists in American politics. If you look at both sides of the aisle, you have Donald Trump, who will be approaching his 80s if he was to get re-election. You have Biden, who's already there and would be in his mid-80s by the time of a second term. You have all these senior figures in the Senate on both sides of the aisle. Dianne Feinstein most recently wheeled in on a wheelchair at the age of 89 into the Senate, a very distinguished Democrat senator. But there's something very odd about the gerontocracy of American politics. It doesn't exist in Australia. It doesn't exist in Britain. It's a phenomenon of American politics in recent years. And that's why I say in that column in the Telegraph that what would really be interesting for this race is not to remain with the gerontocracy race with, Biden versus Trump again, but go down a generation in both parties, go down to DeSantis in the Republican Party, go down to Gavin Newsom, the Democrats, and you've got a real debate. There will be no real debate if it's Biden versus Trump. We could all sing how that will go. We know how it will go. But DeSantis and Newsom, that's a real race. And it's the race, I think, that America needs. America needs to get off the 80-something bandwagon and onto a discussion among people who have run states, who are capable of that and can run on their record. I think this is way overdue, and it would be very, very healthy for American politics if it could get there.
And you couldn't get two politicians who are more different. Yeah, they both run major states, big states, California and Florida, but very differently. Florida and California may share, warm weather and beautiful beaches, but that's about it. So it would be a real ideological battle, that one. That would be fascinating. Now, let's go to the UK, and your old alma mater, Oxford, where women need police protection plus private security, apparently, because you can't say outrageous things anymore, Douglas, like women don't have a penis. That gets you into all sorts of trouble. That's Professor Kathleen Stock we're looking at there, looking like a completely unbothered boss, I've got to say. She faced all the hate and vitriol from the usual tolerance mob. But the hopeful thing here, Douglas, is that there has been a pushback against this suppression of academic freedom. We had the PM, Rishi Sunak, backing Professor Stock, and he said, the rights of a vocal few should not be allowed to stifle debate. I mean, that is a development in the right direction.
I think it is. I think it's a positive development. It won't solve the problem on its own. Of course, the government in the UK has set up a special representative to look into the issue of free speech in universities across the UK and the ways in which academic freedom is being trampled upon. Kathleen Stock is an extraordinary person, an extraordinary woman. And in one way, I'm glad that she's come to the wider audience she deserves. I'm just sorry that it's come at such a personal cost to her of people harassing her, chasing her, trying to intimidate her and bully her. Kathleen Stock is a left-wing feminist of the old school, and by old I don't mean to diminish for age reasons. I don't want to be accused of ageism. I mean that the sort of feminists that you and I, Rita, grew up knowing of, principled. One might have disagreements with them on certain things. Kathleen Stock certainly to the left. But the point is arguing things from principle and from fact and from evidence and reason. And given that, because people like her, another example obviously would be Germaine Greer of an older generation, but because people like Kathleen Stock stuck to their guns about empiricism and facts and Enlightenment values and not going along with just whatever you're told to go along with, she has ended up being defamed, demonized to a quite extraordinary extent. She was chased out of the university that she taught in, and she was invited to go to Oxford. And she had to go, as you say, with protection around her and police holding back mobs in the street outside. I thought it was a great thing that the Oxford Union agreed to have her, invited her, and so on. But I think it's a great shame on the wider society that Kathleen Stock should have been demonized and singled out in this way. And I just want to make one other point, Rita, if I may, which I think is so important, is what Kathleen Stock says is what many others of us have said in recent years. But it is noticeable that the activists in the name of, social justice and much more keep going for the women. And I think this has to be understood. There is a misogynistic anti-woman movement going on here. They are trying to take out Kathleen Stock. J.K. Rowling, who everyone knows about, has said the same things as a male author like Irvine Welsh. It is not Irvine Welsh that people have been trying to destroy. It is J.K. Rowling. It is not me that has to face down mobs like this when I speak at Oxford. It's Kathleen Stock. I think we have to recognize there is a very anti-woman movement. There's a sort of women stay in your place, don't say what you think movement. And I think it should be called out.
Absolutely. It's this new age misogyny which is acceptable among the woke brigade. And the remarkable thing is that what Professor Stock says, 80–90% of the population would agree with. These are very much mainstream views about we shouldn't have male bodies in women's prisons. We shouldn't have children who are too young to understand their decisions, have irreversible treatments they may desperately regret in a few years. I mean, these are not radical ideas that she's putting forward. Now, the deplorable state of academia might explain these findings. Look at this research where 3,000 Americans were asked, how much do you agree that prior to the arrival of the European settlers, Native Americans, Indigenous tribes, lived in peace and harmony? Well, the majority of every educational level agreed with that statement to some extent. And what's worse is that we're becoming progressively dumber, according to these results. Around 70% of Zoomers agreed that prior to European settlement, Indigenous tribes lived in harmony, compared to about 40% for boomers. Douglas, I know you love schooling the ignorant. I mean, this ignorance is profound here.
It is ignorant. I have to say, it is not surprising. If you look at the state of education in all of our countries at the moment, particularly in America, it has to be said, the basic levels of educational attainment are absolutely woeful. You and I have talked about this once before, Rita, but there are cities, major cities in America where, you get 7% of students leaving school with a reading ability or a basic ability at math. So, of course, they're not being taught anything very accurate or at all about history. It is just something they glean from the popular culture. And I think that is one of the explanations for this sort of result. The other thing that has to be said is that, of course, it is also this sort of, people like to use this term white savior, but there's a sort of flip side of that. There's a kind of complex that nothing can go wrong in the world unless the white Westerner made it so. It's a fascinating thing. People can't go wrong on their own. They can have no barbarism unless we were to bring it to them in some form from Western countries. And it's a profound misreading of history. It is one that has, funnily enough, existed for some centuries. And it is totally provably wrong. In fact, one of the people who passed this poll around this week, the distinguished left-wing thinker, Steven Pinker, himself managed to, 20 years ago in his book, The Blank Slate, show what an absolute nonsense this sort of thinking is. In fact, as the data shows, as he showed in that book, if you take the number of men who died in conflict in Europe in the 20th century, that is, in Europe's worst century, the world of the two world wars, if you take the 20th century in Europe, you still have fewer per capita male deaths in conflict than in the indigenous societies that are being talked about here, in particular in North and Central America. So I'm afraid that there is just this extraordinary indulgence of ignorance in our time, where young people have been taught that nothing can go wrong unless it has been done by the Western man. And I think, apart from anything else, it's done a great disservice simply to history. It is so important that we actually understand the complexity of history, that there are no angels in history, that there is no angelic society, there is no Edenic society that has simply been mucked up by the arrival of outsiders. All societies in history have pillaged and conquered and much, much more. But, you know, unfortunately, a generation brought up on a sort of Hollywoodized version of history where they have to always be the guilty party and everyone else the innocent is, I'm afraid, reflected in the results of a poll like this one.
Absolutely, and I think that ignorance is not limited to North America. You would find it right here in Australia as well. And finally, this story, Philip Schofield, I don't even know who this guy is really. He's a absolute obsession in the UK. British TV presenter speaking for the first time about his affair with a much younger colleague, revealing he is utterly broken and ashamed. But he stresses, Douglas, that he did not groom this young man. Now, I know you've written about the UK's obsession with this story. Why are so many invested in this salacious tale?
It's a very weird one, Rita. I can only reassure viewers in Australia that however degraded they think parts of the Australian political debate is, at least it isn't where Britain is. I thought that things couldn't get worse than the obsession over Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary's being sent to a speed test course. That ripped through British politics for weeks. It's been overtaken by this morning television presenter who presented a morning show with a colleague of his, where they got about 500,000 viewers a day, which in British television terms really is very small. About 1% of the population ever watched this show. His personal life details have been spilling out for some years. My own view is that, you know, people's personal lives are their personal lives. If it was shown he did anything illegal, that would be a different matter, but that hasn't been the case so far. However, there has just been this obsession in Britain about this story. My own explanation is that it is all a great distraction. And I think that we all have to be aware of this in this era. You know, there's this endless game of sort of taking people down, tearing people down, getting a politician who's done something minor and blowing it up into a career-ending thing. With this, we've moved on to morning television, and it doesn't seem to me to be healthy. You know, the UK economy has only just missed recession again. We have massive inflation. We have terrible cost of living crises. We have unaffordable housing. We have immigration at historic highs and much more. And the government and the Labour Party opposition don't seem to have any answers to any of this thing. And it seems to me that as a result, the British public and media have decided we'll basically talk about morning television. Well, I think that's not a great answer. There are much bigger things in our time. And I think that anyone who really wants to know what's going on should do what they always say you should do when looking at magicians. Watch the hand you're not meant to watch. We're being encouraged to engage in tittle-tattle about totally insignificant figures. And I think that the much bigger issues of our day are at risk of just gliding by our notice. And I hope they don't.
Douglas Murray, thank you so much for joining me tonight.
Great pleasure as always.